So, where were we? Oh yeah, colonization, revolution, and independence. And I just remembered we forgot to mention the Articles of Confederation. So let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. The country needs a system to govern themselves by. The Articles of Confederation were created. The Articles had many problems. The main one was that it gave way too much power to the states. For example, under the Articles, there were no federal taxes. This meant that the states had to choose how much money they would give to the federal government. The Articles of Confederation deserve a video all to themselves, but to keep things short, by the time of the signing of the Treaty of Paris, many Americans knew the Articles had to go. In 1787, the Constitutional Convention was called. After much debate, the Connecticut system was agreed upon. It created a Congress of two houses, one of which was based on population and the other gave equal representation to all states. It also established a head of state, which would be the president. The Constitution would give an original 10 amendments. These are now called the Bill of Rights. These amendments would guarantee rights such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, right to a fair trial, and others that are now considered basic human rights. The Constitution would not settle all issues, though. One of the biggest would be slavery. Slavery would be a major issue for much of American history, and we'll talk more on it later. The Constitution was not supported by all. There was a high chance that it would not be put into effect since many did not support it. Political parties began to be formed. The Federalist Party was in support of the Constitution and the federal government, and the Anti-Federalist Party was the opposite. In the election of 1788 through 89, George Washington, an independent, was elected president unanimously. Washington did not support political parties, but future presidents would not support his views. Washington would be re-elected unanimously again in 1794, but would refuse to serve a third term, a trend that would be upheld by almost all presidents. Washington's vice president, John Adams, would follow. Adams was a Federalist and the first president to live in the country's newly built capital, Washington, D.C. Adams would create the Alien and Sedition Act, which would limit personal freedoms, and in 1800 he was not re-elected and instead replaced by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, which has no relation to the modern-day Democratic or Republican parties. Jefferson would make the Louisiana Purchase, which would be the largest single territorial expansion in U.S. history. The most valuable part of this acquisition was the port of New Orleans, which would become the first American port on the Gulf of Mexico. Shortly after, Jefferson sent the famous Lewis and Clark expedition to explore the new territories. After Jefferson came James Madison. Fun fact about him was that he was the shortest person to be president. To hide the fact that his legs were short, he wore long pants instead of breeches, which set a trend. Madison oversaw the growth of tensions between the U.S. and Great Britain. These tensions would lead to the War of 1812, which of course would begin in 1812. At first it seemed like America was winning, since the vast majority of the British forces in Europe, fighting France, and most of the early battles took place around the Great Lakes. It wasn't just the British who were fighting the Americans. Several Native American tribes also fought the U.S., since the British promised them territory if they won. After the war between Britain and France ended, much of the British Navy and army were sent across the Atlantic to America. The British attacked Baltimore, causing the battle that would inspire the Star-Spangled Banner, the American national anthem. The British marched troops to Washington, D.C. and destroyed much of the capital. The president was forced to flee the city. The war eventually ended in a stalemate, with neither side taking any territory. 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed, a certain Andrew Jackson led Americans to a major victory at the Battle of New Orleans. Neither side of the battle knew that the war was over. James Madison was followed by James Monroe. Monroe purchased Florida from Spain, but is most famous for his Monroe Doctrine, which said that America would protect the nations of the Americas from European influence. After Monroe came John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, and yes, it is pronounced Quincy. The election of 1824, in which Adams was elected, was the first time that non-landowning white men could vote. Despite not having the plurality of the electoral vote, Adams still won since the election was decided by the House of Representatives. Adams signed the Adams-Onis Treaty, which settled disputes over Spanish territory ceded to America. Adams failed to win a second term. He lost to Andrew Jackson. Jackson was the first commoner to be president. Jackson is often considered the founder of the Democratic Party. Jackson supported slavery and is most famous for his Indian Removal Act. The act forced the peaceful tribes of the American South to move to Oklahoma. 1/4 of the tribespeople forced to move died during the journey. This is all the more terrible since the Supreme Court forbade the act, but Jackson refused to listen. Jackson was an extremely divisive figure, and the Whig Party was formed in opposition to him. After Jackson came Martin Van Buren. Van Buren was not only the first president to be born after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but was also the first president who spoke English as a second language. His first was Dutch. Van Buren would not be re-elected and would be replaced by William Henry Harrison. He would be the first president to be a member of the Whig Party. Harrison did not do much of anything since he died after being in office for only 30 days. Around this time, the Industrial Revolution began to spread to the U.S. Many people moved from rural areas to big cities to work in large factories, mainly in mills. Many farmers also got more tools that would help them. A few years later, the first trains would emerge. Harrison was followed by his vice president, John Tyler. Tyler was technically a Whig, but leaned more to the Democratic side. He annexed Texas 10 years after they revolted from Mexico. This would be a large part of the American Western expansion. Many Americans believed that they had a God-given right to expand westward and push back Native Americans. After John Tyler came James K. Polk. Polk settled disputes with the British over Oregon Territory, giving us the modern-day states of Washington, Oregon, much of Idaho, and Montana. He also started the Mexican-American War, which would give us the rest of the continental U.S., well, except for the Gadsden Purchase, but that's not that important. Many Americans began to move westward. The famous Oregon Trail took people from Independence, Missouri to the fertile farming lands in Oregon. Shortly after, in 1848, gold was discovered in California, which led to a gold rush and a big increase in the population of that state. Around this time, there was a major increase in immigration to the U.S. These immigrants were primarily from Ireland and were escaping the potato famine. In the next few decades, immigrants would come from the U.S. from many countries, primarily through the famous Ellis Island. Many disputes over slavery arose when Western territories began to become states. The original sentiment was that any states south of the Mason-Dixon line would be slave states and those north would not be, but it was then agreed upon that the western states could not support much agriculture and would not have slavery. Disputes arose over whether or not the planned states of Kansas and Nebraska would have slavery. Congress eventually agreed to have the people of those territories decide. This caused a massive flood of pro- and anti-slavery supporters into Kansas. This caused chaos and is now known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1860, anti-slavery candidate Abraham Lincoln was elected president. A few months later, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and yes, they did secede to preserve slavery. Within the next few weeks, the states of North Carolina, Virginia, Florida, Georgia, Arkansas, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, all left the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, or CSA for short. The Civil War had begun. The first battle of the war was the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, which was a fort off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina. The first major battle was the Battle of Manassas. The Confederate Army was put under the leadership of Robert E. Lee. He launched an invasion of the North, and the rest of the war would be primarily fought in northern Virginia. The Confederacy launched another invasion of the North, but was pushed back at the Battle of Gettysburg. A Union army led by Ulysses S. Grant launched an invasion into the Confederacy down the Mississippi River, all the way to New Orleans, splitting the Confederacy in half. Union General William T. Sherman launched his infamous March to the Sea, and shortly after the Confederacy surrendered. This is a major oversimplification of the Civil War, and it deserves a video all to itself. A few days after the Civil War ended, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Johnson was hated by Congress and became the first president to be impeached, but not removed from office. Under Johnson, the Reconstruction began to be started, but was really initiated by the man who came after him, Ulysses S. Grant. The Reconstruction would weaken southern states, but it would also protect the newly freed blacks. Ulysses Grant would be followed by Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes would end the Reconstruction, which allowed southern states to pass racist and segregationist laws. The western U.S. began to become more connected with the rest of the country. It was first connected by the Transcontinental Telegraph and later by the Transcontinental Railroad. In 1867, the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia. The North began to heavily industrialize and saw a major influx of immigration from southern and eastern Europe. Around this time, many large companies would emerge. These companies were only capable of becoming so large due to the recent advances in transportation and communication. Heads of these companies were known as robber barons and were the wealthiest businessmen in world history. The companies were so large that legislation would be passed over the course of a few decades that would break them up. The American economy began to grow rapidly. Ideas that the U.S. should influence nearby countries began to become more prevalent. In 1893, Americans, primarily sugar farmers, in Hawaii took over the government and had the formerly independent country annexed into the U.S. In 1898, a revolution occurred in Spanish-controlled Cuba. The U.S. lent their support to the revolutionaries and sent parts of the Navy down to support them. The Spanish sunk the American ship, the USS Maine, and war was declared. America won the war and took over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Cuba was liberated, but under the heavy influence of the U.S. A similar thing would happen to many countries within the next century. Speaking of which, it's the 1900s, and that's where we'll leave this off. The rest is in part 3. So I meant to do an end card for the last video, but I guess I'm doing it now. I don't really know what to say, I just wanted to do an end card, so, words. How do you like this format so far? I plan to do other things, plan to diversify, but I plan to do videos similar to this, but more in-depth. These videos really aren't in-depth whatsoever, which I mentioned before in the videos themselves. So let's see how this goes.